Do you have some Derwent Inktense pencils and you're not quite sure what to do with them? Well, let's talk about 6 fun techniques that I find myself doing over and over again with these pencils. Hi, Shanna Rowe Jackson here from Caution Artist at Play. Today we are going back to one of my favorites. We are going to be playing with some Derwent Inktense pencils. You will see some footage of this recent drawing while I talk about some of my favorite techniques to do with these pencils. This is not meant to be a step-by-step tutorial, just kind of an overview and talking about ways that I like to use these, tried and true ways that I come back to time and time again. Now, if you're not familiar with these pencils, these are a water-soluble colored pencil, very similar to other watercolor pencils out there on the market, except they are very intense in color, slightly more permanent, and have an ink-like consistency, which of course is why they're called Inktense. Pretty clever, huh? No, this video is not sponsored by Derwent. I just love these pencils and I have for years and years. If you are interested in more videos on Derwent Inktense, I do have a playlist on the channel because I love them so much. All right, so let's get down to it.
Okay, jumping right into the project now and into technique number 1, and that is to mix directly on the paper with your pencils. I am coming in and layering some dark purples and blues because those are contrasting colors to my subject, and I am going to come in, layer them on top of each other, and then wash them out with water. Now, when you are mixing directly on the paper like this, it's a great way to get a high pigment payout, meaning it's going to be much more saturated and darker quicker, and it fills the tooth of the paper quicker because you're getting more pigment on the paper really fast when you are working directly on the paper with your pencil. And after I layered those colors in the background, again, those are colors that I chose specifically because they contrast with the oranges, I'm coming in with my ink black to darken it up and give it a nice, colorful, deep, dark black. This next technique takes full advantage of the watercolor qualities of Inktense. Now, one of the things that I love doing the most with Inktense is using them like watercolor, and that includes doing washes. I have a palette by Caran d'Ache that was made for their Neo Color 2s. It's like an aqua palette. One side is smooth plastic, the other side has a rough side, and it is perfect for this technique. I just color my pencil on the rough side, and then I use water and mix it around directly on the palette, lift it up with my brush, and then paint it on like watercolor. And in the beginning phases of my paintings, especially when I have something really light in color, a lot of times because Inktense tends to be very vibrant, I find that it is helpful to build things up with transparent layers and to come in and work light to dark similarly to regular watercolors. And so that's what you're seeing me do here. You're seeing me just paint it on with a brush. I have not even decided to bring the pencils in too heavily in this part because this is really, really light. I don't want it to be vibrant too quickly. I'm starting out very messy and I will tighten it up later on. I'm working often wet into wet, and then as layers dry, I will come in and tighten things up a bit and add detail further on. And that brings me into this next tip. One of the fantastic things about Inktense is that it is a little bit more permanent than other watercolor pencils. And that means it lends itself beautifully to glazing. So if you wash out your Inktense completely with water, they are less likely to lift after dry than regular watercolor pencils are. And that means you have infinite amount of possibilities when it comes to layering transparently over older layers. So what I am able to do is I'm coming in with my washes, I'm letting them dry, and then I'm coming back in with transparent layers over top without worrying about disturbing the work that I've done below. And this is one of my top favorite ways to use Inktense because I know a lot of people have some frustrations around watercolors being disturbed easily when they're trying to layer. And with Inktense, it's a lot easier to get those layers without having to worry about that. And so you're going to see that a lot here, not just on the linen, but also when I'm working on my oranges as well. I really enjoy building up with transparent layers and mixing optically that way. So you're seeing me use a lot of contrasting colors in that background on the linen, and then you are seeing me come in and mix directly on my oranges with my pencils, just like I did in the background. So the first few tips here are tried and true tips that I use in almost every single one of my pieces, and you're going to see them repeated over and over again in this piece. I am coming in with my pencils to mix, but I am also using a lot of transparent layers in the beginning and building up very slowly till I get the saturation that I am looking for. And then I'm working very messy and then tightening it up as I go. Now that I am happy with the amount of layers I have put down, it is time for me to tighten things up, and that brings me to my next favorite technique, and that is to use these light colored pencil. That is the advantage of having watercolor pencils. You have the best of both worlds. You have the detail and waxiness of a colored pencil, along with the water-soluble qualities and transparent qualities of a watercolor. You're also seeing me come in with a regular colored pencil. That is the Derwent Drawing Chinese White. I am using that to mask, and this is also a great technique to use. I want those highlights to stay white, and so I am using a very soft, waxy pencil to mask my area and act as a resist to these when they're wet down like watercolor. Wax resists water. So if you use a non-water soluble pencil, you can resist the watercolor like nature of these pencils, and you can reserve highlights that way. You're also seeing me come in later on to use it for regular highlights on top of things, and that's plain and simply because I don't find the Derwent Inktense white pencil to be opaque enough to do that, so I just prefer to bring in my Derwent Drawing Chinese White for those details. But so now you're kind of seeing the routine here. I'm building things up with light layers. I am using lots of glazes and being very messy in the beginning, and then I am tightening things up as I go along and using my pencils as final details. So these are the techniques that I am using in every single piece that I do, and the next couple techniques are just kind of fun and interesting that can help you with some special effects. This technique is one that I just find to be so much fun, and that is to let the line do the work for you. I put down a pretty hefty outline there, and then I just took my brush and washed it over it and let the color spill from the lines into the empty spaces. And I'm doing the same thing here on the basket in the background. As you see, I just put in a few preliminary lines. I'm coming in with clean water, washing it over those lines, and it is filling in the blank spaces in between the lines. I find this to be a particularly great technique for illustration. In fact, I really love Inktense for illustration. But as you can see, you can use this technique in realistic pieces as well. I often use it for water. I like to put little dashes of color down for my waves and then wash in between, and it works really well. The final technique that I would like to speak about in this video is dry brushing. Now, with dry brushing on Inktense, I wait until a mixture is almost completely dry on my palette. I'm using very little water. As you can see on the palette, it looked a little bit pasty, and then I'm just very gently scrumbling my bristles on the surface of the paper. I'm not pushing too hard because I don't want definitive lines on there, and I want to be able to move them around gently and softly over the surface to get that kind of mottled texture. And I like using this texture in places where I want to create a certain look or softness, I almost always use dry brushing over layers that I have already had laid down. It's not a technique that I do to create the specific look for something as is. It's in conjunction with the other techniques that I've mentioned, but it can work really well for adding some subtle shading. Inktense, because it is a watercolor-like substance, tends to dry lightly. And so you're going to have less of a chance of that happening when you add less water. And so obviously higher pigment to water ratio, dry brushing will end up being a little bit darker and less subtle than if you're adding a lot of water. Which is another reason why, again, all of this is built up in layers. The pencils are transparent a lot of times when you're laying them on top of one another, and the washes can be very transparent. But there's these in-between spots, a sweet spot when you're using less water that can kind of give you exactly the color you're looking for. Now, that's something that you have to play around with to get that technique down right, but I do think it was worth mentioning in this video. And as you can see, I am going through and doing my final touches on the final orange. Okay, folks, here's the final piece. I had a ton of fun with this, and I really enjoyed talking with you today about my favorite Derwent Inktense pencil techniques. Let us know your favorite ways to work with Derwent Inktense. I'm really curious. I love having discussions in the comments, and I like the fact that we can all learn from one another. All right, thank you so much for watching. You have a fantastic day. See you next week. Bye. Wait, don't go away just yet. If you liked this video, you're sure to like this one too. Also, don't forget to hit subscribe.